So I know many of you are sick to death of even talking about COVID and where it came from and what happened and why it's still here and why what we are doing doesn't seem to be solving this problem once and for all. So as we have on the podcast many times, we've gone to the people at Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization, VIDO. Volker Gertz has been our guest a couple of times, but today we've invited Dr. Angela Rasmussen. She's a virologist at VIDO, and she has also been participating in some international studies on what caused the virus in the first place and working internationally on that. She's an American who has recently moved to Canada, and you survived winter, mosquitoes, and COVID?
Not COVID. Winter and mosquitoes, though. As far as I know, I have not gotten COVID yet. So
Really? You must be one of the few.
I'm very careful about wearing masks.
Yeah.
And I actually have had 4 doses of vaccine.
Okay.
And my first dose was in the U.S.
Right.
That's why I had to get 3 doses here.
Right.
My first dose was Johnson & Johnson. And actually, this is another topic, but there's some interesting data that suggests that your first dose being Johnson & Johnson followed by mRNA boosters actually might provide some better protection against the variants that we're seeing now.
The Johnson & Johnson was supposed to be the one shot.
One and done, but obviously that's not true for any of the vaccines anymore, unfortunately.
All right, let me say a few more things about Angela here. So as I said, a virologist at VIDO. Her research focuses on, and we'll translate this into English later, the role of the host response in viral pathogenesis, with a particular interest in emerging viruses, et cetera, et cetera. We will translate. But looking not just at COVID, but dengue, avian, Ebola viruses, MERS, and of course, the SARS family. She is a member of the Verena. Is that how you say it?
So actually, I am still a member of Verena, but I'm not really anymore. So maybe we should cut that part. I need to update my bio.
That's all right. But that's an international effort to just keep looking and predicting.
But the thing that I would like to highlight is that I'm a pillar lead for COVARNet, or the Coronavirus Variants Rapid Response Network, which is actually here in Canada. It's a national network of different academics from different disciplines. And the pillar that I lead is the host pathogen interaction pillar.
We're going to get into that.
Yeah.
And just worked with an international committee studying the origins of COVID, and you have discovered, or you believe, that it originated in the market, in the Hunan market.
That's correct.
Okay, so I want to get into that because that's a whole other topic. But first, I want to say, where are we? Why are people still getting COVID and getting very sick?
So this is a really complicated question, and I'm going to try to answer it as briefly as possible.
Yeah.
The main reason why we're still dealing with this is because there's still a lot of COVID around. There's still a lot of SARS coronavirus too.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when the vaccines were rolled out, we really didn't get those vaccines to enough people in a quick enough manner. And many countries like the US, my home, have people, 60% of people have been vaccinated. A ton of other people are either unboosted or haven't finished their initial vaccine regimens.
Right.
There's a ton of anti-vaccine sentiment. There's also been a ton of inequity in terms of distributing vaccines to the global south in particular, but low and middle income countries. And when you have a lot of unvaccinated, susceptible people, that provides a very fertile environment for the virus to continue growing and spreading. And when it does that, it continues to mutate. And that's what we're really seeing now with all of these emerging variants. They're very different from the viruses that the vaccines were designed against. So the viruses can effectively get around some of the protection that those vaccines provide.
I guess part of the problem is, and this is such a rabbit hole to go down, but I feel we have to at least try. We have been told so many different things over the last couple of years. Stay home, don't go to work, that's going to solve it. If you get the virus and you're sick once, you'll never get it again. If you get vaccine, 1 shot, 2 shots, you are protected. You won't get COVID and you won't be able to spread it. All of these things have proved to be not true. how come we didn't know, with all the study that goes on constantly about viruses, including the SARS virus, because it's been around since the 60s, why were we so ill-informed?
So a couple reasons. So this virus in particular, SARS coronavirus 2, we've only known about it for 2.5 years.
Right.
And we did know about SARS coronavirus 1, which emerged in 2003.
Right.
And we studied that. But some of this is actually a problem with research. And that is that in countries, including Canada, including the US, and actually most in China, the research was most sustained there. But in Canada, and in particular the US, a lot of funding was put into SARS research when it first happened, but then it didn't result in a pandemic like what we've seen. And so a lot of that funding then went
Just
away.
disappeared.
Research projects dried up. The same thing happened when MERS coronavirus emerged in 2013. And now, frankly, I think we're in danger of that same thing happening with SARS coronavirus 2, just because there are clearly all of these questions about it. And with, no doubt, people, including myself, are continuing to work on it.
Right.
But I think the appetite for addressing it as the public health problem that it is has gone down. And I mean, I'm certainly sick and tired of SARS coronavirus
Yes, I'm
too.
sure you are.
Everybody's kind of sick and tired of it. And I think that we may never get the answer to some of these questions. But a big part of this, again, is that some of those things that you mentioned, you're not going to get infected again.
Right.
If you've been infected before, the vaccines are going to protect you. Some of those things are still sort of true, and they were true, but they're not true completely for the variants that are circulating
Right.
now. And that's the real problem. We were never able to get transmission down to a low enough level that we aren't seeing new variants emerge that can sort of render these things that we were depending on obsolete.
I guess part of the problem, and we were told at the, and this is true in variations in every country, but don't wear a mask. Masks are useless, which I think we all in retrospect understand was about trying to preserve what limited quantities of those products that we had and save them for the medical professionals. But why not, and this is your world, your community, why not just say to people, look, we don't know whether masks work or not, they're going to help. Doctors and nurses wear them every day in hospitals. So we don't have enough to share. So why don't you go home and make one or put a scarf around? I think part of the problem was we felt like we were all being treated like idiots.
Yeah.
And then we started to resist what people were saying.
I mean, I think that there is a lot of, so there's a couple of problems here. One is that sometimes public health messaging can be very paternalistic. And with the masks in particular, and I was among those people. I was skeptical at first up until about April of 2020 about how much masks would actually be useful.
Yeah.
Part of this was our understanding of transmission. I think we assumed that there would be a lot more so-called droplet transmission than aerosol transmission.
Yeah.
I think we were not really thinking about this the right way. And we also didn't have a lot of information. And so the second thing is that we need to figure out better ways to communicate that uncertainty. Because what it looks like, and this is something I've encountered over and over again, is that when you say something, you say, we don't really know, but this is what we think. Then you get some new evidence that changes the way you think about it. A lot of people, their inclination is to say, well, you were wrong.
Right.
You were wrong about this. Like, what else are you going to be wrong about? Rather than understanding that this is actually a normal part of the scientific method where we make hypotheses, we test those hypotheses.
Right.
Sometimes those hypotheses are incorrect, and then we change based on the evidence. I think we've done a bad job communicating that to people, and I think we've also been patronizing in some ways, and we haven't really been straight with people.
Yeah, I think this is a really big issue because if you, as the point you raised earlier, if you want the money and if you want the attention, and we all want you to have it so that you can fix this, there has to be a better relationship with the public, with the end victim or the end user, or however you want to describe that, because that has happened. It's kind of like, okay, enough. You've told me too many stories. Right?
Yeah, it's true. And this has also been exploited in Canada, in the US, all over the world for political reasons too. we're seeing this a lot where suddenly adhering to public health measures and recommendations is a statement of your political ideology. And I think that's a real mistake, and I actually don't know how we fix that problem. Because then it just continues to polarize people, and you can't really even have a discussion with the public without it becoming a matter of political ideology.
No, I mean, we're watching it about everything, whether it's a raid on Donald Trump's house or whatever it is. Your view on that is all about politics now. It's got nothing to do with the role of the FBI or the role of the coronavirus.
Exactly.
So what did you learn in this study? Because again, there's so much conflicting information about the Wuhan market, and this was an animal to animal that then became animal to person disease versus lab leaks, because we've had whistleblowers out of the Wuhan lab. We've looked endlessly at the gain of function research that was funded by Americans and Canadians and carried on there. How, in retrospect, do you look back and say, okay, that's where it was?
Yeah, so this is where we really decided to fall back on our scientific training. Because from the very beginning of all of this, when people started talking about it, and some of my collaborators were talking about it, with Tony Fauci and with people at NIH, people high up in the U.S. Government and HHS. At first it was an emerging virus that nobody had seen before, and so there were unusual features about it, which is not uncommon. So of course the two leading hypotheses are going to be that either it was naturally emerging, zoonotic infection, like most other emerging viruses, or potentially it could have come from a lab. And so, there's been, as you just said, there's a lot of chatter about all the different types of evidence that would point to either hypothesis. But so we just decided to look at the evidence that we could verify, because we knew that we weren't going to be able to see all of the evidence.
Okay, just let me interrupt. Evidence, like you just completed this study a few months ago. So is this new evidence, or it was stuff that was preserved at the time?
It's a combination of new evidence that we found, as well as material that was available at the time and through the WHO mission report. So we knew, obviously, that the virus emerged in Wuhan, and we knew that the WIV was there.
Right.
We can't know what the WIV was working on. We only have the professions of scientists that have worked there about what they were doing. They've said that they didn't have any progenitor viruses that you could have engineered SARS coronavirus 2 from. They didn't have any viruses that were like SARS coronavirus 2. But we can't verify that.
No, and there were whistleblowers, and there was the doctor who died, and
yes, and so that's where it gets complicated, because a lot of those accounts are also unverifiable.
Right.
And then the U.S. State Department, shortly before Donald Trump left office, said that 3 workers at the WIV had gone to the hospital with flu-like symptoms. That's also unverifiable. The only thing that really we could verify about the so-called lab leak hypothesis is that the virus emerged in Wuhan. So we wanted to look at other evidence that we did have access to that would give us some clue one way or the other. And so in looking for all of this, that means going through things that the World Health Organization has, early case reports, and really not just taking their word for it either, because we know that
because that's also an issue,
right? And we know that the WHO also has limited power, right? The WHO is not some sort of international health police that can show up in China with, we've got a warrant, we're going to search through your lab freezers.
Right.
They also have to rely on the information that they're able to gather and that they're told. We know that several witnesses actually were not truthful about the fact that live animals were being sold in the Wuhan market. Right. So we set out to take as much information as that we could verify and try to understand what that indicated. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we looked at were the early cases. And it was really important to try to pinpoint when the epidemic would have started.
So China had preserved that evidence, the researchers there, or when you say early cases, what do you mean?
So this was published in peer-reviewed medical journals. It was also recorded in the WHO mission report.
Okay.
So we looked at those and we tried to cross-reference them and confirm as many cases as we could. Then we extracted the geographical coordinates of where those people lived. And we conducted what's called a geospatial analysis to assess where those things were clustering. Where in Wuhan were they relative to the Wuhan market, towards the Wuhan Institute of Virology, towards any other thing in Wuhan. And by applying statistics to this, we found that there was a very low probability that this would have started anywhere except for the Wuhan market. And the reason for that.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. I was just going to say the reason for that is that all these early cases clustered around the market.
Yeah.
Now, people have said, well, they already knew the market was an early super spreader event.
Right.
They had already identified that. So what if this is a result of what's called ascertainment bias? So people deliberately sampling in a biased way to include the market. The reason why we know it's not ascertainment bias is that there were also a number of cases that had nothing to do with the market. People had never been there. They'd never gone there. They weren't related to anybody who shopped there. And those cases actually were more strongly statistically associated with the market than the cases that had a known market link.
Okay, explain that. So if you've never been near the market and you don't know anybody and you don't eat anything that comes out of there, then what's the correlation?
These people still all lived around the market, even though they had
Just
never
physical.
actually gone there.
Okay.
And what that indicates is that it's like throwing a rock into a pond, and then the ripples move outwards. Those people are the ripples living near the market. Never been to the market. They're indicative of the market, of the virus spreading outwards into the community from the market at its epicenter.
Right. Okay, because the other concern, the other criticism of this is, where you look is where you're going to find it.
Right.
And if you're not looking over here, or if you're not looking at the lab, you're not going to find it there because the market is a super spreader situation.
Right. So that's why we actually relied on multiple streams of evidence. We didn't want to rely on these early case data pieces alone to tell us what was going on. So we already had some other really critical pieces of information. And that included a paper that came out in last summer, in 2021, that indicated that multiple species of live animals were in fact being sold at the Wuhan market. And many of those animals not only are known to be susceptible to SARS coronavirus 2 infection, but were actually involved in the zooanthroponic transmission, or transmission between animals and humans, of SARS coronavirus classic in 2003, specifically raccoon dogs and masked palm civets. And so these animals were being sold in the Wuhan market. We don't have any samples from the animals, but then we did some detective work and we uncovered a report from the China CDC that showed that there were positive environmental samples all over the market.
On the floors and the stalls.
Yeah, so the CDC, the China CDC, went in and started swabbing things in the market because they knew it was a super spreader. So we looked at where these positive environmental samples were, and we found that disproportionately they were on the western side of the market, specifically in the southwestern corner. We did a lot of digging through administrative business records, maps that were available online, to confirm what stalls these positive samples actually corresponded to. And guess what? They were the stalls where animals were being sold. And on top of that, some of these positive samples were actually taken off of things like cages and carts that were used to transport cages, and in one case, a hair and feather removal machine. So things that were directly associated with these animals being at the market. And then one last thing, that this is a crazy coincidence. In 2014, one of our co-authors, Eddie Holmes, who's at the University of Sydney in Australia, was visiting Wuhan and was taken by his colleagues to the Wuhan market as an example of a place where this type of spillover was likely to occur. And he took a photograph of raccoon dogs in cages at a stall where there were 5 positive environmental samples on cages. And to us, it's not a smoking gun because we don't have any of the animal samples.
Right.
But to us, that was a really, really strong indication that a lot of the virus at the market was really strongly associated with the animals themselves.
So animals would have been infecting each other at the market, and that happens in the wild and both in some contained setting like a market. At what point or how, or maybe I'll just start with why, does it jump from an animal to a human?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Now, this also has to do with some of the uncertainty here, because we don't know and may never know where these animals were sourced from, but we do know that they were part of a common supply chain. And we also know that in this supply chain, and once they're at the market, these animals are kept in extremely close quarters with many, many species next to each other, cages stacked on top of each other, overcrowded cages. Really, the opportunity for transmission between the animals is really
Easy.
good. Yeah. Then people are walking around, and of course, people, aren't trapped in cages and they're not immobilized like the animals are. But if there are enough infected animals and there are people walking around and there are people, getting up close to the cages, handling the animals, butchering the animals, inspecting the animals for purchase, they're going to be in very close quarters with them. Now, we don't know how zoonotic transmission occurred. We don't know if it was, fecal or exposure to urine or feces. We don't know if it was aerosol, what it was.
Touching their nose or their
Touching,
mouth.
anything like that. It could
I'm
have
having
been.
a little trouble with this conversation, but yeah, carry on.
It's pretty gross.
It's very gross.
It's definitely not how I would or how I do conduct animal husbandry, but that's the reality, and so you can understand that repeated contact with enough people and enough animals, the virus gets in there, and all it takes really is that virus to spread among the animals, and then it can get back into people. Now, another thing we also know, and this was partly from a companion paper, is that there had to be at least 2 spillover events, because there were 2 early, essentially, variants of the virus. They're not very different, but they were different enough that we know that they were 2 distinct evolutionary trajectories that the virus
So what
took.
accounts for that?
So that's based on sequence data that we have. And that's a normal thing that happens with RNA viruses when they start spreading in a population.
So you don't mean a different virus jumping from this animal to this person?
No, I mean it's like 2 variants that are circulating.
Right at the beginning.
They're very, very similar variants, but they are distinct. And because we knew that these 2 variants existed, that suggested that essentially they had to have emerged into the human population, because we knew about it from human cases, within about a week or 2 of each other. Now, that means that the lab leak is pretty implausible, because essentially what it means is that one of these lineages, called lineage B, would have had to emerge in the human population and start spreading around the market in that area surrounding it. And then about a week later, lineage A would have had to do the same thing. Now, this is really important, because what it suggests is that these viruses were spreading and evolutionarily diverging, potentially in the animals for a little bit of time before they entered the human population and began spreading. And it's really only the conditions in a densely populated city like Wuhan, in a densely populated place like that market, that would allow for that jump to be made, but then for human-to-human transmission to begin. And that's how the pandemic really began. The reason this excludes a lab leak is that in order for this to happen, you'd have to have somebody at the lab get infected with lineage B, go straight to the market without infecting anybody else along the way, and start infecting people at the market. And then about a week to 2 weeks later, you'd have to have the exact same thing happen with lineage A. It's not impossible, but it's pretty unlikely.
So the gain of function research that is underway and is funded, and which I'm sure occurs in other places around the world, that's a risky business. There's no any way you look at it, because however implausible that scenario is, people in a lab could get infected and it could happen another way. Make the case for gain of function research?
Sure. So I want to start by saying that the vast majority of virology research is not gain of function research. And you were wondering about like my research program, for example. I don't do gain of function research, because my focus is on how the host responds to an infection rather than the virus.
We're going to come back to that.
Yeah, rather than the virus doing the infecting.
And
this is important for gain of function research, though, because the gain of function research is really done for a couple different reasons. One is to try to understand what features would allow a virus to be a better pathogen, so that if we encounter it for the first time down the road will be ready for that. And we know some of these things, like such as the furin cleavage site, which is actually not a brand new thing. Furin cleavage sites are present in a number of different viruses. That's the big feature that everybody's talking about that's so weird about SARS coronavirus 2. So they had never found a SARS-related coronavirus that had a furin cleavage site. But other coronaviruses do have them. So MERS coronavirus, for example, has a furin cleavage site.
Okay, what does that mean?
A furin cleavage site is just basically a signal for an enzyme called furin to come along and chop up the spike protein. And this chopping up process is something that needs to happen for infection to be very efficient.
Okay.
Basically, the furin cleavage site in SARS coronavirus 2 is kind of the secret sauce that allows this virus to be so transmissible.
So does it exist in the common cold or the flu virus that we see same process?
Some influenza viruses do have a furin cleavage site. Ebola has a furin cleavage site.
Okay.
MERS coronavirus, as I mentioned, has a furin cleavage site, and I believe that 1 or 2 of the common cold coronaviruses have a furin cleavage site. So furin is actually an enzyme that is a host protein. We have that. And there's a lot of these host proteases, they're called. They're like little molecular scissors that go around chopping up proteins at a specific place. And that's just mostly because sometimes these proteins have to have something chopped off for them to work, essentially.
So when you say we, do you mean us, the host, the host, people?
I mean humans, yes. Furin is a human protease. It's also present, though, in most mammals.
Yeah.
So that's why viruses evolve furin cleavage sites, because viruses are parasites. They can't replicate without a host, and so they adapt to the host that they're in so that they can make better use of the host's hardware to replicate themselves.
And does that explain how it jumps from different species?
So it may. Certainly the furin cleavage site, we know from our own lab work that the furin cleavage site's really important for infecting an animal, for example, and for infecting people. One of the reasons we know that actually is that if you just grow up SARS coronavirus 2 in some cell types in the lab to make a stock, the furin cleavage site gets lost, the virus kicks it out, essentially, and then that virus is attenuated if you try to infect a hamster with it, for example. So the reason why you do gain-of-function research, back to your original question, is to try to understand how these things work, because they're clearly so important for these viruses to infect us and cause disease. They're also really important in terms of studying vaccines. So if you want to make a vaccine, especially if you're trying to make a pan-coronavirus vaccine against a bunch of viruses that you may have never even seen before, you really want to know the key parts of that virus. And so that's the reason why some people, again, not myself, do gain-of-function research. But I think that there's really a need to have a better public understanding of this, because the way that it's sort of being portrayed is that virologists love to just like one-up each other by making viruses that are progressively even worse, and it's so reckless. The people who do gain-of-function research really, I think, are probably just as concerned, if not more so, about biosafety than anybody else. And it's really, you have to go through a lot to justify doing this. That's one reason why I don't do it, honestly, because it's pain. I don't want to really deal with all of that. The other thing, though, that people really do need to realize is that this is not just, sitting down like before you go into the lab and just start cooking stuff up. Right. You really do need to plan this out, and our safety protocols in the lab are extremely stringent. So I do work with regular original recipe SARS coronavirus 2, as well as many of the different variants in the lab. And I certainly don't want to have lax safety protocols, because as I mentioned, I've never had COVID. If I'm sloppy in the lab, or if there's a containment breach, who's going to get infected first? It's going to be me.
It's going to be you. And accidents happen as well. Like, that's the other issue, right?
Accidents do happen, but they happen pretty rarely. And to put this into perspective, a paper came out on Tuesday in Nature Communications, And it was led actually by Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance and Shizheng Li of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And it was a collaborative effort to study spillover in Southeast Asia from bats to humans. They estimated that annually there's a median of about 67,000 spillover events that occur. And you might be wondering why we don't have 67,000 pandemics of SARS-related coronaviruses. And it's because in many of these cases, that spillover is a dead end. So spillover is happening all the time, a lot more frequently than lab leaks. But as far as we know, there has never been a novel pathogen that has caused an epidemic or a pandemic because of a laboratory accident. On the other hand, and I think this is what gets really scary about this, right?
Yes, it does. What you're saying
because you can beef up lab safety,
yes,
but you can't do anything about 67,000 spillover events happening outside of our control. And I think that's one of the things that really does have appeal about the lab leak theory, because there's a clear solution to fixing that problem.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lot harder to deal with the world's biggest gain of function lab, and that would be Mother Nature.
Yeah, the real world. What got you interested in this when you're a little girl growing up in Seattle, or why did you decide you wanted to do this?
Two things. When I was about 10, I got pneumonia. It was bacterial pneumonia, but I was really, really sick, and I became fascinated with infectious disease. I just didn't, it was mind-blowing to me that something so small that you can't even see it could just completely lay you out like that. I've had asthma ever since. It's been, something that's profoundly affected my life. And so I became really interested in microbiology then. When I was in college, and this is pretty cliche for virologists, and it's not really embarrassing, but I read The Hot Zone, and it kind of scared me. Well, it did scare me, but now I realize, having worked with Ebola too, that a lot of the stuff in The Hot Zone is really exaggerated.
Yeah.
People are not weeping blood. They tend to die of diarrhea, actually, in many cases. But it really got me thinking about these emerging diseases and how much of a threat they present to us. And just from a scientific perspective, they're also fascinating because there's always more to learn about them.
So we've got kind of two strains, which is your I shouldn't use the word strains because it means something different here. We've got two issues, which is, you guys figuring out what all these viruses are and what the likelihood is and why spillover events don't end up turning into epidemics. But you said something about the impact on your life, right? When you got the severe pneumonia. And I think there's a whole lot of thinking over here, which is what is COVID doing to us over the long haul? We don't know. And secondly, what are vaccines doing to us over the long haul? Because that research was really condensed and short. Now, for a reason. Please, let's get as much out there as we can and all the rest of it. But now we've got these two different worlds. Is there enough scientific energy and money to deal with both of those things?
Well, I hope so, and that's why I keep advocating for this. One thing that is becoming more and more clear, we're still really failing to use vaccines the way that we should be using them. And the monkeypox epidemic that's currently happening right now is a great example of that. I mean, this is entirely bad policy on the part of the U.S., but the U.S., had a large Jynneos stockpile, the vaccine that is really well tolerated, as part of a strategic national stockpile to guard against a potential terrorist attack with smallpox, which has never happened. Those vaccines were not released to the people who needed them early on when we could have potentially stopped.
You mean
the
right
spread
in
of
this
monkeypox.
current?
Yes, in this current one. Those vaccines were withheld because of the possibility that, we might use up this stockpile and then I guess Russia could attack us with smallpox.
Right.
And I think that's really the wrong thing to do. You don't want to be slow. You don't want to not deploy the tools that you have to contain an outbreak. And that's what we did. And we're still failing in that regard because if we had actually sent more vaccines from that type of vaccine, if we had manufactured more of them, if we had sent them to Central Africa and West Africa where monkeypox is endemic, we might not even be having the epidemic that we're having now because we would have stopped it where it is endemic.
But then you've got these other political issues, to go back to that one. If it's a predominantly an issue in the gay community, then no politician in the world wants to say that out loud.
Right.
Or say, we're going to offer this to your community, because right away you're
well, and even before
people.
that, they're not offering it to people in Nigeria,
Right.
in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that's what we really need to be thinking of, because we
Go
need to
back to
stop
the
thinking
root,
about this as, oh, this is only affecting the gay community, this is only affecting this or that marginalized community, this is only affecting a country over there.
Right.
We live in a global world.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
SARS coronavirus 2 should have really illustrated for us that when an epidemic happens, when it starts, you have a very limited window of time to stop that. And if you have the tools to stop it, you need to use those tools. And the first of those tools needs to be vaccines. Now, we think about this going forward. We're seeing other vaccine preventable diseases coming back. In the US, there's clearly community transmission of polio, and one person at least has been paralyzed. We've eliminated polio. We had eliminated polio.
Yeah, we thought,
and now it's back because people aren't getting vaccinated. And by undermining vaccines, vaccines are not perfect. They're not a magical shield. They're not a force field that's going to prevent you from ever getting sick or infected. Right. But vaccines work best when they're done at population scale. If most people are immune to a virus, because they are, again, parasites, it won't be able to spread and gain traction in that community. And that protects, in turn, the people who can't be vaccinated or the people who don't respond very well to vaccines. We're thinking about this as individuals, and we really need to be thinking about it at population level, and we need to be thinking about it as the global population.
What are we going to do now? I mean, given where we're at, and we've both kind of discussed this and agreed that because the communication was bad and because it's been politicized, and there's a whole lot of reasons, we're now at a place where this virus is still alive. In this country and others, the vaccination rates are really high, and it's still alive and it's still functioning. So how do you make the case? What's the argument? How do you get people to go once a year and get a vaccine when we are starting to see some, albeit rare, cases of the vaccine also having an impact that is not healthy?
Right. So the vaccine still has an extremely safe profile in terms of side effects, and any vaccine, any drug. I mean, you can find cases where people have died of from taking ibuprofen.
It's all that little writing on the bottle at the back,
exactly,
which you may die.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing is completely safe.
Right.
There's only unsafe and safer. But I think that we really do need to be communicating to people, and I don't have the answer to this. It's the short answer, because, and I don't think anybody does, because
or we'd be doing it,
by now. But I mean, to me, it's evidence based, and the evidence so far. I mean, a lot of people say, well, if your vaccines work so well, then how come people are still getting BA5?
Yeah.
And there's a couple answers to that, but the simplest one is that only 20% of people in Africa have received any kind of vaccine.
Right.
And if we want fewer viruses circulating in Canada, we need to make sure that people in other parts of the world are getting access to vaccines, and not just vaccines, but good vaccines that actually work. Because in many countries, people have gotten access to other vaccines that are not approved in Canada and which don't actually appear to work very well.
Which is, we got into trouble in this country because that's what we were doing as well, as we were making this contribution to the international cause. We were sending stuff away that we didn't want to use ourselves.
Right. And that certainly does. I mean, there are certainly people with very strong anti-vaccine sentiments in other countries, and I can hardly blame people if they think that they're getting the cast-offs of wealthier countries, the stuff that didn't work. I mean, why would you want to take that vaccine if you don't think it's going to work, and if you think it might not be safe? Not to mention how insulting it is to say that, you're not good enough for the mRNA vaccine. Yeah. So here, take this crappy, adenovirus vectored vaccine or whatever. And I think that we've done a real disservice to all of us by the way that we fulfill vaccine orders, the way that we distribute vaccines globally. Organizations like COVAX, which was a combined effort of WHO, CEPI, and Gavi to provide vaccine doses to low and middle income countries, really should have first dibs on a lot of those vaccines. They should have just as much purchasing power as the United States and Canada and Europe and the UK. And that's not happening. And that's why we're still seeing these variants, because there are pockets of people around the world who are very susceptible, and the virus will continue to evolve. That's the one thing we know for sure. It's going to continue to evolve. It's going to continue to work its way around our vaccines. When we update our vaccines, which should make them more effective against Omicron and the Omicron subvariants, we need to make sure that people in other countries are getting access to those as well. Because if they're not, then we're just going to continue playing variant whack-a-mole indefinitely.
Yeah. But this is the problem. I mean, so the vaccine companies, the Pfizers, the Modernas of the world, I mean, they went to work, they did it, they got this out, they get marks for that. But they're not going to sell their product at some reduced rate. And so how do we actually make that realistic? Of course, they're going to sell the best stuff they've got to the countries that can pay.
Well, some of this has to do with manufacturing capacity, and some of it has to do with intellectual property.
Yeah.
So part of it is that there needs to be pressure put on those countries or on those companies to share their IP so that other people can manufacture
intellectual property.
Yes, intellectual property.
Sorry.
The other thing is that we need to build out infrastructure for manufacturing so it can be manufactured locally.
In other places.
And that includes Canada, by the way. I mean, one of the reasons we
shut down all of ours,
Well, one of the reasons I came to Vito was that I was incredibly impressed with what Vito was doing, including building out the VDC, or the Vaccine Development Center, which is effectively a clinical trial scale manufacturing facility, which Canada didn't have.
Now, I was listening to Volker Gertz, the head honcho here, the other day. So he basically, if I understood him correctly, what you're trying to do here is have like a one-size-fits-all vaccine. Take this, and at least it's going to prevent, SARS-related variants that we don't even know about, or that are still existing, or that are morphing, as opposed to something very specific. So this would be something we could use everywhere and distribute everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. So Vito is working with CEPI to develop a
Explain that one again. I wrote that down.
Okay,
the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative.
That's right. So CEPI is a large international coalition of people funding research into vaccines. And also they're part of COVAX, so they're involved in vaccine distribution. They're really, the whole idea of CEPI is that if we want to stop these infectious disease threats, we need to make sure that not only are we developing the best vaccines we can, we need to make sure that we are getting them out to people, that people are willing to take them, and that we're distributing them equitably and to the people who need them most. So the idea behind a pan-coronavirus vaccine, and Vito's not the only ones working on this. There's many in the pipeline, and certainly in the U.S., NIH is also sponsoring a lot of this research. But the idea is that you could get one vaccine, it would protect you against SARS coronavirus 1, SARS coronavirus 2, SARS coronavirus 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the ones that we haven't discovered yet.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fantastic idea, because that would allow us to be prepared and might even stop one of these viruses from emerging. But it is a pretty steep technical challenge to come up with that. And it's probably something that people are going to have to keep updating, because as we go out and
learn
look,
more.
every time we go out and look for viruses,
6, 7, and 8,
we find new ones.
So
it's probably not something that's going to be like, okay, well, we got this vaccine now, like no more problem with SARS viruses ever.
No, and we do have to stop saying that. We have to say we're in learning mode. Are we going to be taking vaccines every year, do you think?
For the foreseeable future, I do think that we'd probably be needing updated boosters, whether it's annually or every couple years, I'm not sure. But as long as we have SARS-2 continuing to transmit broadly around the world, we will see new variants emerge. It's just a matter of time. And then there's the whole other issue of SARS in animals.
Right.
And that's something that with COVARNet, this Canadian research network that I'm very interested in working on, we already know that SARS coronavirus 2 is a generalist. It can infect many different animal species. We know that here in Canada, it's infected, for example, white-tailed deer, mink, things like that. We are interested, my group in COVARNet is very interested in which North American animals could it potentially infect and establish a new reservoir in, because that could potentially allow for new variants to emerge from that animal reservoir. Okay, explain
that. Does that mean if we eat deer meat, we might get sick, or does it mean we can catch SARS from our dog?
Probably not eating deer meat, but being in contact with deer. And certainly there has been one probable case of transmission of a deer variant to a human in Ontario.
And we got lots of them here too, as you know.
Yes, I do. So
I see them on the highway all the time.
So probably the hunters need to be careful, but not the people who are eating the venison.
Okay.
Can you catch it from your dog? Well, so far we haven't heard of that happening. And dogs are actually, they're susceptible, they get infected, but they don't seem to shed as much virus as cats. Cats worry me a lot because cats, are indoors, outdoors. They're feral. They can, certainly domestic cats will go hang around with feral cats potentially. Those feral cats are hanging out with other kinds of wildlife. And that certainly could allow for the establishment of reservoirs among those animals where the virus is spreading among them with very, very unpredictable results.
Why do you really think you didn't get COVID?
Oh, well, I think I probably just didn't get COVID because as I said, I got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine.
Yeah,
I've had 3 Pfizer shots since moving to Canada because I honestly just couldn't figure out how to transfer my vaccine records from the U.S.
we can't even upload them here. Don't worry.
Yeah, no. So I just said, okay, as far as Canada's concerned, I've had 3 doses of Pfizer, but I had J&J before that. And there is some emerging data that shows, at least as far as neutralizing antibodies are concerned, that regimen using Johnson & Johnson as a prime with mRNA boosting does potentially have a broader neutralizing antibody response, meaning that antibodies that are produced with that vaccine regimen are capable of inactivating viruses from the Omicron family.
And did you stay away from parties? Did you never get on a plane?
I was about to say that I did in the first couple years of the pandemic really stay home a lot. Prior to the pandemic, I was on the faculty at Columbia University in New York. My husband lived in Seattle, though, so I was commuting back and forth between New York and Seattle for 5 years. That all stopped in March of 2020. I had to choose whether I was going to stay by myself in my apartment in Manhattan or stay in our house in Seattle, and I chose to stay in Seattle with my family, and we just, ordered groceries in and were fortunate enough to hunker down for 9-10 months. And I didn't travel until that October when I finally decided that I was leaving Columbia and I was going to move out of New York, and so we went back there to get our stuff out of our apartment. Since this year, though, I have traveled quite a bit. I've been to Europe twice. I'm going again next month, and I'm just really careful. So I wear an N95, like a legitimate N95 on the plane, especially on the ground. So when the plane gets up in the air, planes have pretty good HEPA filtration systems. So I will eat and stuff on the plane, but I try to wear my mask as much as possible, and I always wear it while taxiing and takeoff and landing and things like that. I also am really careful to wear it in the airports, in taxis, in any kind of situation like that. When I'm traveling and I'm staying in a hotel, for example, I don't go work out in the gym. I'll try to take a walk. When I go out, I try to eat outdoors or in restaurants that are really
But do you run through your hotel room with a can of Lysol?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't. One trip, we did bring these portable HEPA filters, but the last trip I forgot them, and neither of us got COVID. I mean, my husband and I, neither of us got COVID. I did bring tests too. And so on all these trips, I have not gotten COVID, and for some of them I had to actually test before coming back to Canada. And it used to be that I'd have to do a PCR test. So I feel pretty confident that during the travel and stuff, I didn't actually get COVID and, just tested negative
And
for it.
do you think you're going to continue to sort of live like that?
Yeah, as long as there's big waves of Omicron happening, I do. And I'm sitting here without a mask, but
Right.
I have my mask.
Yes, I've got mine too. Yeah.
And I'm like in the lobby of this hotel, for example. It wasn't very crowded when I walked in, so I
Right.
took the mask off. But
Yeah.
if there's a lot of people, especially if I'm like at a conference, a scientific lecture or something, and I'm just sitting in a room with a bunch of other people, there's no reason why wearing, a KN95 or a CAN 95, because these are Canadian made, it's really not that much of an imposition to me.
Yeah.
And the other thing about on planes, I mean, masks are inconvenient and annoying, especially N95s.
Right.
But I also really like the fact that I haven't had a cold in the last 2.5 years. And I for that reason, I mean, it's really, really not an imposition to wear a mask, because I'd rather wear a mask than
Have a cold.
feel like crap.
But the other thing that's happening, and I know this could go on forever here. I'm not gonna steal any. I want you to go and solve scientific problems. I don't want to have all your time here. But honestly, we're starting to see the psychological effects of this. Of course, you don't have conversations with people on planes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of stopped. But that's just this little, when you think about kids not socializing at schools or developing communication skills or people skills, like this is going to change who we are.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that, there really needs to be some thought as we go into, the lessons learned, conversations about how we can do stuff like this. Because obviously these so-called lockdowns, even though they weren't really lockdowns for everybody.
No.
Certainly essential workers had to keep going to work, and
Correct.
It wasn't healthy for a lot of people, and it really didn't work because we're still dealing with all this stuff. We need to think of better solutions that are going to be more effective for everybody besides, people who can afford it and are privileged enough to stay home can do that.
Yeah.
And kids just don't go to school, and essential workers, best of luck.
Yeah.
We need to be thinking about policies that would actually be meaningful. So, for example, and monkeypox is another great example of this. People who get monkeypox might have to isolate for up to 4 weeks. There's no paid sick leave in the United States that is going to allow people to do this. So people are going to have to choose between paying their rent, feeding their families, or doing the right thing for public health.
Going to work and infecting other people, maybe.
Rather than imposing this kind of stuff on the entire population, whether it's warranted or not, we need to think about how people can be supported by the community to do the right thing for everybody. And that's really what public health should be about.
We have got to learn a lot of lessons that we haven't yet learned about this. So that's another conversation. And if you survive another Canadian winter, and if you survive the onslaught of Saskatchewan mosquitoes, then we'll talk again.
That sounds
I'm not
great.
worried about COVID getting you. I'm worried about winter and mosquitoes.
Yeah, minus
getting
40 degrees. Well, like I said, I got a new car with a remote starter, and I upgraded my DEET. So the next time I go to the lake, hopefully I won't get as badly eaten.
We were having this conversation sort of offline here a little bit about she thought everybody in Canada had Teslas because everybody plugs in their cars. But this is not about having EVs. This is about having block heaters on your engines so it starts when it's 50 below.
Exactly.
Dr. Angela Rasmussen, she is a virologist at VITO, the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization at the University of Saskatchewan. They are doing some amazing work there. So thank you, and stay as long as you want here in Canada.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Senator. And I've got my permanent residency application in,
okay,
so
done.
You're not getting rid of me.
Okay, that's perfect. We'll talk again soon, I hope.
Thanks
Thanks
you.
again.
Me too.
And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela.